Dann sage ich herzlich willkommen zu einer weiteren Ausgabe von In, Up, Out. Heute mit einem sehr spontanen Interviewgast. Wir haben uns hier in Tansania im Ressort kennengelernt und ist auch für mich ein komplett neues Thema. Rachel wird sich gleich auch nochmal vorstellen. Wir führen das ganze Interview auf Englisch, arbeitet bei einer NGO und hat auch in dem Kontext schon mit Unternehmensberatung zu tun gehabt. Rachel, great to have you here.
Thank you.
Maybe just to let the German people know, what are you doing? Who are you? Where did you study? Give some introduction to them.
Sure, thanks a lot. My name is Rachel. I currently work with a non-governmental organization, or an NGO, as they're commonly called. I work across a couple countries in Africa. So the NGO itself is called PEAS, which means Promoting Equality in African Schools, and we focus on building the secondary education sector in African countries where there is a gap in access to secondary education. Because there's a lot of provision of primary education now after the Millennium Development Goals, which really focused on access to primary. But at the moment, in places like Tanzania here, only like 1 in 4 children go to secondary school. And a lot of the problem is that there are just not enough secondary schools. So the NGO that I am part of, we partner with governments to help bring in outside finance from people like GIZ, the German development kind of agency, also DFID, which is the UK equivalent, to basically buy land and build schools and then make sure that when we open them, they are run in partnership with the government. And my background, so prior to doing my current role with this NGO, my title is Head of Research and Development, which means that I look after sort of data, evidence across the organization, but also work on developing new programs and kind of testing them, trialing them, rolling them out, all focused on education. And the reason I have that job in the NGO is because my background is actually in research. So I actually have a PhD in international politics, which I did in the UK at Cambridge. And so after kind of finishing my research degree, I wanted to do something that was more applied. So not being an academic, but still using my kind of analytical skills, research skills to contribute to development. So I first worked actually as a consultant to the NGO sector. So I worked with a consultancy in London for 3.5 years that did lots of advice to NGOs. And then since 3 years now, I've been working actually in an NGO. So actually having to take my own advice, implement programs, that kind of thing. But I'll pause there.
Very cool, very interesting. So was it always your goal to have that scientific background and then switch to an NGO, because your track seemed pretty direct to that, right?
Yeah. To a degree, I think kind of advice for anyone starting out their career is you sometimes think you know exactly what you want to do, but then you have one experience that teaches you something different about yourself, and then another experience, and you build kind of an idea of what you want to do over time. I think for me, I've always been interested in the rest of the world and how through the way I spend my time to make it slightly better, knowing that any individual's contribution is generally small. But I guess that made me always interested in politics and development. I would say too that even since school, I was kind of quite enjoyed sort of research, analysis, like have quite, I guess, a academic brain. So kind of wanted to pursue that for a while. I actually thought when I was doing my PhD, I might want to be an academic, but learned through doing it that I didn't like the idea of being kind of isolated, having to write these kind of books for kind of months to years at a time, and also not have much direct access, I guess, to decision makers, because you're so far away from like people who are actually making policy or changing what they're doing. So I think doing the PhD taught me that I actually wanted to be in more applied research, which is why I decided to actually go into consulting or an NGO, which for me has been a good fit because it means I get to, you know, run big research projects, look at big data sets, ask questions about, is this program working? Are we using the money effectively? What have we learned about this that would be useful for government to know? But actually ask those questions and then immediately feed them back to the people who it matters to. So the actual government policymakers, to the actual kind of CEO of the NGO who's deciding what strategic direction we take. So I think through learning about myself, through doing kind of an academic sort of degree, I realized that this was the best fit for the way I like to think and the kind of work I want to do.
Cool. I'm interested in how does a typical project or project you're currently working on looks like, because at the moment it seems pretty broad. You've done several things, project management. So how does a typical project look like?
Yeah, sure. And I'll maybe describe what a project looks like if you're a consultant working with an NGO, because I get a sense that might be what your audience is interested in. So I think a lot of people assume NGOs are very different from kind of private sector businesses or kind of other organizations. But actually in many ways they're very similar. If you look at any kind of decent size NGO, they'll have a variety of different teams that have like distinct functions. So for example, the NGO I work in, we have a team that's all about basically revenue generation, right? So we'd call it fundraising because we're trying to basically win money from development agencies, from grant makers, trying to bring revenue into the organization to allow us to do the work we want to do. But it's similar to people who'd be in sales or marketing. So what's the sales and marketing strategy? What's the fundraising strategy? And you would do a lot of consulting kind of projects, I guess, for NGOs where you're looking at that. So it's you have a project where you're saying we want to increase the revenue or the fundraising that the organization brings in from, say, 1 million annually to 2 million annually. How are we going to do that? So it's a project where you're looking at, okay, what's the end goal? And then what are the different kind of, research questions we need to ask? Who are the kind of people we want to target? Where's our consumers, our audience, and thinking about kind of how you're going to test different strategies and come up with a plan that basically allows this NGO at the end of the project to go and pursue the strategy to be more successful in the revenue generation. So that's actually very similar to doing something that would be like a sales or marketing strategy. We also have people who work in finance and operations. So looking at things like human resources, using staff well, focusing on whether the organization's hitting its targets. So again, you can imagine consulting projects that are doing maybe a operational review. So how efficient were we over the past year in deploying our staff, using our resources to achieve this impact? And you might be doing like an organizational change kind of consulting project where, again, you're saying, okay, well, there's quite a bit of inefficiency in this part of the program. How can we rework that either through the staffing or the way that money's spent to make the whole organization higher functioning, right? Again, very similar to a private sector thing. And then I guess on the product side, which we would call like our program, there's a lot, again, around looking at the overall efficacy of what you're delivering. This is the kind of role I have. So saying like, how do we know if the product's good? So how do I know if our program is making a difference through helping girls in Africa to enroll in school, stay in school, and leave school with good learning outcomes, right? And that we're doing something that's actually better than what would have happened had we not intervened. So people who are doing lots of sort of research. So I would lead a research project comparing like the communities that we work in and what's happening to girls in those communities with kind of communities where there is no school or the school is like a government secondary school. So trying to understand, is what the program's doing any better? And again, using that to feed back into the product refinement, product development strategy. So what's good, what's bad? How do we make the product better? So it's slightly different reasons that, NGOs need these consulting projects, but like they might be hiring an expertise because it's something that they don't know how to do themselves. Maybe sometimes it's useful to have an external person come and do that piece of work with them, particularly if it's a sensitive area like operations. But actually at the end of the day, the type of work you do isn't that dissimilar to what you would do in sort of a more classic business kind of, I guess, consulting area. And we did all those kinds of things, I should say, in my consultancy, everything from fundraising strategy to monitoring and evaluation, impact evaluation, all kinds of different things.
I'm also interested in, or it's also a question from the community, do you somehow work in dangerous countries? What type of problems do occur there?
So personally, the organization I work for, we don't work in, I guess, conflict affected states, which is probably what you're alluding to. However, there are many NGOs that do. So for example, I have a good friend who works with NGOs in Somalia, which effectively has no governance in kind of a large portion of the country. And I think in those contexts, it's really hard to work completely independently. You're usually having to work through, for example, the United Nations. So like the UN will have like a mission in Somalia, and hence the NGOs that are working there under the security auspices provided by the UN. And they might be working within a compound, going out with a security outfit to deliver their program during the day, coming back to the compound at night. So I think it depends on the nature of the work you do. That NGO, for example, is working with children who've been affected by violence, and obviously in conflict-affected states, that's a big issue. So it's important for them to be in conflict-affected states. The nature of the work my NGO does, though, as I alluded to, is very much about partnering with somewhat stable governments to develop the education sector. So we're generally looking at places that have a certain degree of stability, have an actual government plan or commitment to expand secondary education, and where we're coming on board to help them meet their own development target. So it's a slightly different, I guess, type of country that we would go into with our program, but many NGOs do work in kind of, I guess, more dangerous or conflict-affected settings.
Okay. I'm also interested in the way that people look at your projects. So education might seem something that is always good, and I think mostly also the people you help see that so. Yeah. How about situations where people don't want your help, where they reject your help or your project?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think how to put it, it's a great it's a big criticism, I think, of the NGO sector in places like Africa, that a lot of, to be quite frank, white people come in assuming that they know what the country needs, right? Saying that, okay, well, obviously children here can't read, so you need to do this. And there's usually, if you come in with that attitude, a lot of pushback, understandably, from, presidents, African ministries of education, who obviously see the same problem, but it's not that they've been ignoring it. It's that there's many hurdles that they may see that you don't see that prevent them from achieving that goal that they want. Yeah, so for example, with literacy, it might be the case that, the government has a limited budget for education. They don't have enough money because they don't raise enough taxes from their population to basically provide both a secondary school place, so literal physical school, as well as a highly trained teacher in every classroom all over the country. They can't do both, right? So they're kind of trying to decide how to use a limited budget to invest in the highest impact areas. So whether that's teacher training, getting more books in, better schools, they can't do it all, right? And if they could do it all, then they probably wouldn't have the challenge, right? So if you want to have a sustainable, intervention or kind of project to try and help, it really needs to be designed in collaboration with what we would say the stakeholders on the ground. So the local government officials, the Ministry of Education, local people as well, that you kind of feel that you're coming up with a solution that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past, and also where they are a key partner in wanting that to happen and wanting to sustain it. So I think a lot of NGOs get that wrong, and hence then do get a lot of criticism where they've come in with they call it like the white savior complex, assuming that we know how to fix things in places that we know nothing about. So I think there's a real need for collaboration and partnership. Specifically in education, I think you are right. I think most people would not argue, oh, it's a bad thing to give people education. I think it's probably one of the simplest areas to go to a community and say, we want to build a school, and people say, great, because people really do want their children to go through school. They really do want, young people to have opportunities they didn't have, right? Like, I think that's not an argument that you have. I think the challenge is more around how do you make education relevant? Because, for example, even here in Tanzania, the children who do finish secondary education, many of them are unemployed because there are not enough jobs in the formal sector that need someone who has, been able to complete physics, chemistry, all this knowledge. There's not jobs that link up with that. Many of the jobs are still in kind of agriculture, very kind of low-skilled work. So there's an argument, it's like, oh, are you setting these children up for failure by trying to give them an education that is like far beyond the needs of the economy today? And sometimes I think we get criticism on that. So like, why not focus on technical and vocational kind of training, or something that's more relevant to kind of the current work in a place, rather than just focusing on getting them better education. And that's a fair debate, and I think that's a fair debate to have with kind of a Ministry of Education as well, where they want to invest, where they think there's a need for kind of partnership and growth, and what skills they need for their economy too.
Okay. Which of your skills, maybe maintained in the 3.5 years as a consultant, help you now in this environment, really being in the NGO?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So I think personally, the thing that you learn from consulting, and I should say too, in the NGO, there's 3 of us that are former consultants. So there's me, our chief operations officer, used to work for McKinsey. So she's a kind of former, private sector consultant. And then our head of HR also was from a consulting background. So the 3 of us bring that into the NGO. I think the skill sets that you learn that are helpful not only in an NGO, but any kind of organization you might go into, are really around how to structure a question, how to structure a project to answer that question, how to lead great meetings, so how to make use of people's time in an efficient manner, and particularly senior people's time, because often when you're a consultant, you're working with very senior teams and organizations, so you learn how to interact with and make use of the time of people who are like CEOs, head of development. So kind of learning how to get the best out of those people and make sure that whatever project you're running is efficient for them to participate in. And I think too, something around how to present your findings, how to present your kind of meetings in a way that is concise, and also kind of gets to the point quickly. I think particularly, I, having come from an academic background, probably what consulting gave me was, I could always do the analysis, bring out the insight, but how do you communicate that very simply and quickly to someone? And I think consulting teaches you that very well. So yeah, so I guess in a nutshell, the project management, leading meetings really effectively with senior people, and then kind of how to present things really kind of clearly and concisely are real skill sets that I think benefit anyone who does consulting and then moves into another type of organization, whether that's a social purpose organization like an NGO, or even just a private business that also needs those kinds of skill sets and people who can do that.
Nice, thank you. 2 more questions?
Sure.
Then we're done. When you describe the surroundings, the different projects, what I need to think of is the complexity in stakeholder management, because projects in companies in the private sector can be complex, but in NGOs you have far more and also more different players to satisfy. What did you learn regarding stakeholder management, or what would be your tip to handle stakeholder management, even if you're not in an NGO?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you're right that the stakeholders in an NGO setting are probably different than they are in a private business. So in a private business, you've got your board, who are often shareholders, who have a lot of power because they usually own part of the company, and so what they care about matters. In an NGO, we also have a board of trustees who are legally responsible for the charity, so legally responsible for making sure it follows the law, that it is financially well managed, that it doesn't go under. So they have a similar degree of importance and influence, but at the end of the day, they don't own the organization. They don't benefit privately from any kind of revenue that the charity generates. So it's a different relationship. So we've got our board of trustees, who are kind of usually very professional people from kind of the business world, also some from former NGOs, but who kind of work as an advisory body for the charity, and where the CEO has to work with them regularly to have review meetings and check that what the charity is doing is good. You also have your funders. So that would be anyone like, for us, the UK Department for International Development, who gives us a lot of money. You have to manage them and make sure that what you're doing kind of meets their requirements, that you're delivering against their goals and the goals for the money that they gave you. So we have lots of kind of different stakeholders that are funders. Then obviously on the operation side, we talked about local government stakeholders. So we spend a lot of time and have full-time people who work on basically advocacy and government relations in the countries that we work in. So meeting regularly with the ministries of education, the district education offices, making sure that those relationships are strong, that they also believe in what we're doing and are committed to sustaining it. Then you've got your own staff, right? So you've got kind of your own teams, making sure that they kind of all feel well supported, empowered, and are on mission, like kind of believe in what the organization's doing and feel rewarded for their work. And then right at the base, you've got your beneficiaries or customers, so the actual children in our schools, the parents who would come to enroll their children in the schools, and making sure that whatever we are delivering meets their needs and it's what they want. And that also is something that will be sustained for the future because it meets a genuine need in the community. So you're right, it's complex. And all of those audiences won't always agree on what the charity should do or what the NGO should do. The very senior stakeholders or sometimes the funders say, well, we've got a new interest in, for example, disability-focused education. And we might say, well, that's a great thing to care about. But actually, where our NGOs working, there are not so many children with disabilities that even go to primary school. So it's very hard to tackle the problem at secondary school. So there's a bit of push back and forth between dialogue. And I think that alludes to the advice, which is, I think managing stakeholders is really relationship management. So making sure that you have kind of regular consultation and meeting structures in place. With our trustees, obviously we have standing meetings. Kind of there's one every quarter with the full board and more regular ones with individuals on the board so that they understand the direction the charity's going in. Giving them meaningful decisions to input onto. So kind of things where maybe there's some ambiguity on whether we go this way or that way, and trying to give them all the information, education they need to try and help us take a decision, so they feel that they can meaningfully steer the charity. Also with kind of your beneficiaries, and I'll stop after giving this example, but saying like we do, and my team leads this, like a series of surveys every year with our students, trying to understand their experiences in the school, what's going well, what's going not so well, even with our graduates, what challenges they are having in their life, what they wish they would have gotten from their education. So that, again, you have that bottom-up feedback from those stakeholders as well on kind of whether this product is something that's working and whether we can make it better. So I think having well-structured periods where you have review, consultation, but also involve those stakeholders in kind of meaningful discussion around the options available so that they understand, the pressures the charity's under or kind of the different kind of options available, and can kind of help steer that in a way where they feel that they're part of it too is really important. Because the second that you say, oh, we don't care what you think, we want to do our own thing, or you just say, oh, we're just going to take a decision and report back later, that's when stakeholders start getting unhappy, right? Like, understandably, you'd want to feel that you were able to influence decisions and input, but that has to be managed obviously carefully too.
Okay, so let me sum that up for a second, all we heard now, before we come to the last question. First, we learned that people within NGOs or consulting NGOs can have several backgrounds, like you, very academic, but also people who come from highly practical consultancy firms. Yeah. We also see that the projects highly differ from country to country, the complexity differs, and that also leads us to a more complex stakeholder management, and you tackle that by more conversation to the people, more manpower somehow for every stakeholder, and that helps to get smooth projects and realize the results. Sure. Okay, so the last question is a little more personal. I just thought that, or what I recognize when I see many people who've been in business or whatever before and then move to an NGO, they somehow need to build up a financial deposit, some financial background. So my question is, do they pay you well, to be a little stitchy?
Yeah, good question. So it's quite interesting how, I guess, pay in the NGO sector compares to kind of the private sector based on which country you're in. So obviously in the UK, and I'd imagine it's the same in Germany, people working in the NGO sector generally do earn less than they could with their skill sets and experience were they in the private sector, right? So working for a private company. In Africa, it's the reverse. So here, our country staff, if you work in an NGO, that is the best job you can get in like Tanzania. So you will be better paid being the head of like Oxfam Tanzania than you would be if you were in like the biggest, I don't know, mobile phone company like in the country. So it's a weird distortion. Countries that receive a lot of aid, people who are very talented, they want to be in the NGO sector because they know they can earn well. And it sounds terrible, but there's often greater job security if you're working for an international employer, like an international NGO, and you've got some certainty around, you know, being paid and the benefits and kind of the idea that the organization will be there for the long term than you do if you go through kind of the local economy or kind of a self-made entrepreneur. So it's interesting because the type of people and the reasons people go into the NGO sector in, say, Africa are very different than the reasons they might go into it in the UK, which means that in our own organization, although both our African teams and our UK team are very talented, the reasons people are there are slightly different. So in the UK, as you allude to, it's often people who are very highly skilled, but want to work for something that they care about. So they kind of take some financial cut or accept that they will only ever earn a certain amount because they want to work in kind of social change. Whereas in Africa, you can work in social change, but also be benefiting yourself quite a lot too and your family because it's seen as a really good job. Personally, I earn okay. I guess how to put it. I live in London. It's an expensive city to live in. I'm well above the median income. But yeah, it's difficult to, for example, on my current salary, save for a deposit for a house. So sometimes you do have people who say, okay, well, I really want to work in the charity, but I'm first going to work for 10 years in finance or consulting and, you know, maybe save up money for get my house deposit, all that sorted, and then maybe I will change careers at the point that I feel like I've secured, I guess, a few things that I want to take care of financially. As we alluded to, I think that's a fine strategy. I think everyone understands that. People obviously have their personal kind of needs and things they need to take care of. And even if you spend a lot of time in the private sector, those skill sets can be very helpful to you when you come to the NGO sector as well. They're generally very appreciated. But yeah, at the same time, you know, I have a very good life. You know, I've just come on 2 weeks holiday in Tanzania. I live in a very nice bit of London that I like a lot. So I don't think that you have to assume that you need to live in poverty yourself to work for an NGO. I think there are good roles out there and there's good pay available. To give you an idea, the top paid roles in an NGO in London would be making maybe like £70,000, £80,000 a year for like the senior people. Middle management's maybe more like 40,000, 50,000. So it's okay salaries. It's okay money. The entry level roles are generally not terribly well paid, but that's kind of true too in other sectors as well. So the top end people will never earn as much as the kind of private sector people, but you can still have like a comfortable life, and it comes down to what your priorities are, I think, relative to other things.
Rachel, thank you very much for your honest answers. You really enlarged my horizon, especially in the NGO sector now and projects and all that happens there. So, I switch back to German. Ich hoffe, das hat euch gefallen. Ich fand es wirklich sehr bereichernd, sehr interessant von Rachel, da ein bisschen was zu hören, was Projektmanagement, Unternehmens- oder dann auch Stiftungsberatung in diesem NGO-Bereich ausmacht. Mich interessiert, hat es euch gefallen? Kennt ihr jemanden oder könnt ihr jetzt selber sagen, okay, ich würde gern da mehr erfahren, wollt ihr mehr darüber wissen? Lasst es mich einfach wissen. Bin da sehr offen, auch weitere Leute aufzusuchen in dem Bereich und freue mich natürlich wie immer, wenn ihr das Ganze in irgendeiner Form teilt mit Freunden, die das auch bewegen könnte. Und ich sage vielen Dank fürs Einschalten und bis zum nächsten Mal, wenn es wieder heißt Let's Talk About Consulting. Ciao.